the quiet heart of Betty's diner, a frail elderly couple was about to face their worst nightmare. Their peaceful Sunday lunch turned deadly when Terry, the Titan Kline, a disgraced MMA fighter, swaggered in and began terrorizing them with cruel taunts and escalating threats. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical diner patron. For over 3 decades, he was a legendary martial artist and decorated law enforcement veteran, known for neutralizing dangerous situations across multiple continents with surgical precision. When Terry decided to publicly humiliate an aging Navy veteran and his wife, he had no idea he was performing his aggression in front of a living legend. Seagal responded with calm authority and a masterclass in conflict resolution that would echo through the small town for generations. What began as casual pie and coffee would become a defining moment of justice. The town of Aspen Heights would never be the same after witnessing what true strength really looks like when wielded by someone who had transcended the need to prove it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sunlight spilled through the dusty blinds of Betty's diner, casting long golden rectangles across the worn linoleum floor. The afternoon heat had settled into a comfortable warmth inside the small roadside establishment, where ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, barely disturbing the air scented with coffee and grilled onions. A Merle Haggard song crackled through speakers that had seen better days, providing a fitting soundtrack to the unhurried Sunday rhythm. Martha Reynolds dabbed the corner of her mouth with a paper napkin, her movements delicate despite hands marked with age spots and slightly bent from arthritis. "This peach cobbler is even better than last week's Ruby," she said, smiling up at the waitress who'd just refilled her coffee cup. "Betty's secret recipe," Ruby replied, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. She'd been working at the diner since high school, 6 years now, and knew every creak in the floorboards, though between you and me, I added a little extra cinnamon. She winked, then glanced at Ed. "How's that coffee, Mr. Reynolds, strong enough?" Ed Reynolds, his weathered face creased with laugh lines earned over 78 years of Texas living, nodded appreciatively. His military posture remained intact, despite the cane resting against their booth, a necessary companion since his second hip replacement. "Perfect Ruby reminds me of the coffee we made during my Navy days, strong enough to stand a spoon in it." The Reynolds had been coming to Betty's every Sunday after church for as long as anyone could remember, so long that their booth near the window was informally reserved. No one had to say it. It was just understood. They were fixtures in Aspen Heights, respected and quietly adored. "You need anything else, you just holler," Ruby said, moving to check on the young couple in the corner booth. The diner wasn't crowded, just the Reynolds. The young couple, a pair of truck drivers nursing their coffees at the counter. Old Pete reading his newspaper at his usual spot. A typical peaceful Sunday in the kitchen. Pots clanged as Toby, the teenage dishwasher, fumbled with a stack of plates. "Shoot," he muttered, followed by the distinct sound of something breaking. Ruby rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Everything okay back there, Toby?" "Yeah, fine," came the hasty reply, followed by more clattering. Martha chuckled, turning to Ed. "Reminds me of our Tommy at that age, all limbs and good intentions." Ed smiled, reaching across the Formica tabletop to cover. His wife's hand, with his own 52 years of marriage, had created a language between them that required few words, a simple touch, conveying what paragraphs couldn't. The peaceful moment shattered when the door swung open with unnecessary force. Bell jangling violently against the glass, every head in the diner turned as a large man stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the modest space. Terry Kline stood in the doorway, sunglasses still on. Despite being indoors, a tight black t-shirt stretched across his broad chest, showcasing the remnants of a once impressive physique. Now softening at the edges, the faded logo of an energy drink company was just visible across his right shoulder, a lingering reminder of sponsorships long expired. A patchy beard couldn't quite hide the scar along his jaw, a souvenir from his fighting days. "Hey folks," he announced to no one in particular, voice too loud. "For the quiet diner, hope everyone's having a nice boring Sunday." He chuckled at his own comment. Ruby approached with professional politeness, table for one. Terry surveyed the nearly empty diner as if he were choosing the best seat in a crowded arena. "Counters fine, sweetheart." He dropped onto a stool with a heaviness that made it creak in protest. then tossed his sunglasses onto the counter. His eyes were bloodshot and the scent of whiskey clung to him like cologne coffee. Ruby asked already. Reaching for a mug got anything stronger. Terry grinned, then waved dismissively at her expression. Just kidding, darling, coffee's fine and whatever's hot off the grill. Terry twisted in his seat, looking around with an air of entitled boredom. Pretty quiet little place you got here in the kitchen doorway. Toby appeared, freezing mid-step when he spotted Terry. Holy crap, he whispered, eyes widening. That's Terry, the Titan Kline. Ruby shot him a warning glance, but Terry had already heard his posture straightening with the recognition. Kid knows his MMA. Terry said, grinning wider. Now that's right, boy, 3-time heavyweight contender should have been champion. 2 if those judges weren't blind. His voice rose with each word clearly meant for everyone to hear. Toby hovered uncertainly. I saw your fight against Mendoza, the one where you knocked him out cold in the 2nd round. Terry finished nodding with, exaggerated humility, yeah, that was something, wasn't it? Back when fighting meant something, not like these pretty boys now. He scoffed, then took a loud slurp of the coffee Ruby had placed before him. The diner had gone quiet except for the low murmur of the young couple's conversation, and the rustle of old Pete's newspaper. Ed and Martha continued eating their cobbler. Though Ed's shoulders had tensed slightly, Terry drummed his fingers on the count of the silence, apparently uncomfortable for him. So this is what people do around here, huh? Just sit and eat in silence. He laughed too loudly. Man, no wonder nobody's heard of this town. Ruby slid a menu toward him. The meatloaf is today's special. Terry barely glanced at it. Whatever meat potatoes, just make it quick. His gaze drifted across the diner, landing on the Reynolds. He studied them for a moment, then called out, Hey there, folks, enjoying your meal? Martha offered a polite smile. Yes. Thank. You been coming here long? Terry pressed, swiveling his stool to face them directly. Ed's voice was measured many years, I bet. Terry said, smirking, probably been sitting in that same booth since dinosaurs roamed right. He chuckled at his own joke, looking around as if expecting others to join in. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Terry's grin faltered slightly. What's the matter, Gramps? Cat got your tongue? Ed took a slow sip of his coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. We're just enjoying our meal. Son, that's all, son. Terry's eyes flashed. With something dark. You're what, 70-80, bet you got some stories about the good old days, right? When men were real men. His tone dripped with sarcasm. Martha's hand found Ed's on the table, a gentle squeeze of support. My husband served his country with honor, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Terry leaned forward on his stool. Oh, a war hero, how about that? Bet you got some medals tucked away somewhere gathering dust. Ed's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. I did my duty like many others. Terry laughed harshly. Duty? Yeah, sure, old man. Bet you never had to face anyone who could actually fight back, right? Just shooting fish in a barrel. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ruby moved closer, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Terry, please, these are good people. Good people. Terry's voice rose. What makes them so good, sitting here taking up space, eating their mush while real warriors like me get forgotten? He stood up from his stool, his large frame towering over the seated couple. You know what your problem is, pups? You and your generation. You think you deserve respect just for existing. Well, let me tell you something. Respect is earned, and you ain't earned nothing from me. Ed slowly placed his coffee cup on the table, his movements deliberate and controlled. Son, you don't know anything about earning respect? Terry's face flushed red. You calling me son again, old man? He took a step toward their booth, his fists clenching. Martha instinctively moved closer to Ed, but her husband's hand remained steady on hers. Terry continued his rant. Maybe you need someone to teach you some manners, show you what real strength looks like. The truck drivers at the counter had stopped their conversation. Pete had lowered his newspaper. Everyone watching the confrontation unfold with growing unease. Ruby positioned herself between Terry and the Reynolds, her voice firm, but diplomatic. Terry, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down or leave. Leave. Terry's laugh was bitter. I ain't going nowhere, sweetheart, not until Grandpa here shows me some respect. He gestured wildly toward Ed, who sat quietly observing the younger man's agitation with the patience of someone who had seen far worse. Storms, you want to know about earning respect? Old-timer, try stepping into a cage with someone half your age, twice your size, and see how tough you really are. Ed's voice when he finally spoke was quiet but carried the weight of decades behind it. Young man, I've faced dangers you can't imagine, and I've learned that the strongest people don't need to prove it to anyone. Terry's face contorted with rage as the words hit their mark. You think you're better than me? Is that it sitting there all high and mighty in your little booth eating your pie like you own the place? Well, newsflash, Pops, your time is over. Men like me are the future, and if you can't handle that, maybe you should crawl back to whatever nursing home you escaped from. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point. Everyone could feel it. The air thick with the promise of violence when suddenly the door chimed again. As Terry's verbal attacks became more hostile, the door swung open and in walked a figure who immediately captured the attention of the room. Seagal entered, with the same quiet confidence that had defined his decades in martial arts and law enforcement. His presence was unassuming yet commanding, dressed in simple black jeans and a dark shirt. His long silver hair pulled back, his weathered face bore the calm expression of a man who had seen enough conflict to know when trouble was brewing. He moved with fluid grace despite his years, each step deliberate and controlled as he surveyed the scene before him without saying a word. Seagal took a seat at the far end of the counter, positioning himself where he could observe the entire diner, his dark eyes missing nothing as they took in Terry's aggressive posture, the Reynolds' quiet dignity, and Ruby's obvious distress. Terry, still in the middle of berating Ed and Martha, shifted his focus when he noticed the new arrival, his tirade faltering as recognition dawned on his face. Well, look what we got here, he said, his voice taking on a different tone, part mockery, part genuine surprise, if it isn't the action movie star himself. Steven Seagal in the flesh. Terry's entire demeanor changed as he turned away from the elderly couple, his attention now fixed on what he perceived as a bigger prize. Hey there, movie man, he called out loudly. Come to show us some of those fancy moves you do in the pictures. Seagal ordered coffee from Ruby with a simple nod, never taking his eyes off Terry. His silence seemed to unnerve the former fighter who had expected some kind of reaction, some acknowledgement of his presence. Instead, Seagal simply sat there, radiating a calm that seemed to fill the space around him. You know, I always wondered about guys like you, Terry continued, his voice getting louder as he tried to provoke a response. All that Hollywood nonsense, making people think you're some kind of real fighter when you've probably never been in a real scrap in your life. Terry moved closer to where Seagal sat, his swagger returning as he sensed what he thought was an opportunity to regain face after his confrontation with Ed. I mean, come on. Everyone knows those movie fights are all fake, right? Choreographed dancing, basically. He laughed harshly, looking around the diner for support that didn't come. The other patrons watched nervously, uncertain what would happen next. Ruby hovered nearby, clearly torn between her desire to maintain peace and her fascination with seeing how this would unfold. Seagal accepted his coffee with a quiet thank you to Ruby, his movements smooth and unhurried. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Terry paced back and forth, his energy manic and unfocused, while Seagal remained perfectly still, his presence grounded and centered. So what do you say, action hero? Terry taunted. Want to show these people what you're really made of, or are you just going to sit there drinking your coffee like some old has-been? Seagal took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression never changing. The silence stretched out uncomfortably until finally he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the diner. I'm just here for coffee, friend. Terry's face flushed with irritation. Friend, he spat. I ain't your friend, pal, and I don't think you heard me. I asked you a question. He moved even closer, until he was standing right next to Seagal's stool, his bulk casting a shadow over the seated man. The diner held its collective breath, everyone sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Pete had abandoned his newspaper entirely. The truck drivers had turned completely around on their stools, and even Toby had emerged from the kitchen to watch. Ed and Martha remained in their booth, but Ed's hand had moved to rest protectively on his cane. Seagal seemed completely unperturbed by Terry's proximity, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed, yet alert in the way of someone who had trained for decades to read and respond to threats. You know what? I think, Terry continued, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing whisper. I think you're scared. I think all that tough guy stuff is just an act, and when faced with a real fighter, someone who's actually been in the cage, you don't know what to do." He straightened up, crossing his arms over his chest with satisfaction. Seagal finally looked up at Terry, meeting his eyes directly, the younger man expecting to see fear or anger. Instead, found himself looking into calm, dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. There was no challenge in Seagal's gaze, no threat, but also no fear, just a quiet assessment that somehow made Terry feel smaller than any insult could have. "I'm not looking for trouble," Seagal said simply, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. But Terry mistook this restraint for weakness, his grin returning as he sensed what he thought was vulnerability. "That's what I thought," he crowed, turning to address the diner like a performer working a crowd. "See, folks, this is what happens when Hollywood tough guys meet real fighters. They fold like cheap suits." He turned back to Seagal, who hadn't moved from his position. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test everything both men believed about strength, power, and the true nature of courage. Terry began to circle Seagal like a predator sensing wounded prey, his confidence building with each word as he mistook the martial artist's calm for weakness. "You know what your problem is, movie man," he said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "You've been playing pretend for so long you actually believe your own hype. Well, let me educate you about what real fighting looks like." He stopped directly in front of Seagal, his hands balled into fists. "I've been in the octagon with killers, men who would eat you alive and spit out the bones while you were playing dress-up in Hollywood. I was taking beatings that would put you in the hospital." Terry's voice rose with each boast, his need for validation driving him to more extreme claims. Seagal continued sipping his coffee, his expression unchanged, as if Terry were merely discussing the weather. This apparent indifference only fueled the former fighter's rage. "I'm talking to you, Seagal," Terry snapped when his monologue failed to generate the response he craved. "Don't you sit there and ignore me like I'm some nobody." He slammed his palm on the counter, making the coffee cups jump. Ruby flinched and moved back, but Seagal's cup never wavered in his steady hand. "You want to know something about respect?" He continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Respect is taken, not given, and right now you're disrespecting me in front of all these people." Terry gestured wildly around the diner, his movements becoming more erratic with each passing moment. "So I'm going to give you one chance to apologize for thinking you're better than me. One chance to acknowledge that I could break you in half without breaking a sweat." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Everyone in the diner understood that they were witnessing a moment that could explode into violence at any second. Seagal finally set down his coffee cup, the small ceramic sound seeming loud in the tense silence. He turned slightly on his stool to face Terry directly, his movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed. But there was nothing theatrical about the way he looked at the younger man, his gaze steady and measuring. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had maintained throughout the confrontation. "I've been where you are, angry at the world, feeling like everyone owes you something." Terry's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Don't you dare try to psychoanalyze me, old man. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through." Seagal nodded slightly, as if conceding the point. "You're right. I don't know your story, but I know anger. And I know what it does to a man. It makes him weak, makes him desperate, makes him strike out at people who never did him any harm." His eyes flicked briefly toward Ed and Martha, then back to Terry. "That's enough." Terry snarled, his face flushing red. "You think you're so wise sitting there spouting philosophy? Well, here's some wisdom for you." He stepped closer until he was nearly chest to chest with the seated Seagal. "In the real world, the strong survive and the weak get crushed, and right now you're looking pretty weak to me." The diner patrons watched in horrified fascination as Terry continued his verbal assault. "I've hurt people. You couldn't even imagine hurt them bad enough that they never got back up, and you know what? The best part was they deserved it, just like you deserve what's coming to you right now." Ruby had backed away until she was pressed against the kitchen door, her hand poised over the phone ready to call for help. But something in Seagal's demeanor made her hesitate. There was no fear in his posture, no tension that suggested he felt threatened. Instead, he seemed almost sad as he watched Terry's performance. "You done?" Seagal asked quietly. When Terry paused to catch his breath, the simple question seemed to deflate some of the former fighter's momentum. because for a moment he looked uncertain, as if he hadn't expected his target to respond with anything other than fear or anger. Terry recovered quickly, puffing out his chest. "Done, I haven't even started, old man. I'm just getting warmed up. See, the thing about guys like you is, you think reputation protects you well. I'm here to tell you it doesn't." He began rolling his shoulders, loosening up his muscles in preparation for what he clearly intended to be a physical confrontation. "When I'm finished with you, everyone in this crappy little town will know that Terry the Titan Kline is still the baddest man walking the earth, and you're just another has-been who couldn't back up his mouth when it counted." Seagal stood up slowly, his movement so controlled it seemed to take forever. The simple act of rising from his stool transformed him from a quiet coffee drinker into something else entirely. Though he was slightly shorter than Terry, his presence seemed to fill more space to command more attention without saying a word. He had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Terry took an involuntary step back, his bravado faltering as he found himself facing someone who radiated quiet confidence. Instead of desperate anger, "That's your choice," Seagal said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone of finality that made everyone in the diner lean forward to hear but understand something. "Young man, real strength isn't about hurting people. It's about having the power to hurt them and choosing not to." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You've been talking about respect and strength, but you're going about it all wrong. You want people to fear you, but fear isn't respect. It's just fear. And when the fear fades, which it always does, you're left with nothing." Terry's hands trembled slightly, whether from rage or something else entirely. As Seagal's words hit home, the confrontation had reached its crucial moment where words would either prevent violence or trigger it. Terry's trembling hands clenched into fists as Seagal's words about fear and respect echoed through the silent diner. The former fighter's face contorted with a mixture of rage and something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. Of truth, he didn't want to acknowledge the weight of Seagal's quiet wisdom pressed against his chest, like a physical force making it difficult to breathe normally, as the implications of what had been said began to penetrate the armor of denial and self-justification he had built around himself over the years of decline and disappointment. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Terry snarled, his voice cracking slightly, the desperation bleeding through his attempt at intimidation. "You think you can just stand there and lecture me like I'm some kind of child? Well, let me show you what happens when someone disrespects Terry the Titan Kline." The words came out in a rush, fueled by panic and the terrible realization that this man had seen, through him, completely had recognized the hollow bravado for what it really was, and had offered him something far more terrifying than any physical confrontation: the possibility of genuine change. The diner had become a pressure cooker of tension, every patron holding their breath as they watched this drama unfold before their eyes. Ruby's hand hovered over the phone behind the counter, her fingers trembling as she tried to decide whether to call for help or trust that somehow the situation would resolve itself without bloodshed. Old Pete had gripped his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles had turned white, while the truck drivers, Jake and Mike, had positioned themselves strategically near the exit, ready to intervene or flee. Depending on how the confrontation developed, Ed Reynolds had half risen from his booth, his military training automatically assessing the tactical situation and calculating the best way to protect his wife. If violence erupted while Martha's gentle hand on his arm reminded him that sometimes the wisest course of action was to trust in the better angels of human nature, even when those angels seemed nowhere to be found in the current circumstances. Without warning, Terry lunged forward, his right fist cutting through the air in a wild haymaker aimed directly at Seagal's head. The punch carried all of Terry's frustration, all of his desperate need to prove himself, all of his rage at a world that had moved on without him in one violent explosion of movement that represented everything he had become. In the years since his fighting career had collapsed into mediocrity and irrelevance, the strike was thrown with the kind of reckless abandon that came from having nothing left to lose, from being so far down that the only direction seemed to be further into the darkness. But what Terry hadn't considered was that sometimes, when you thought you had hit bottom, there was still further to fall, and sometimes the only way to stop falling was to let someone catch you, even if that meant admitting you needed help. The diner erupted in gasps and shouts as patrons scrambled backward, expecting to witness a brutal beating, that would leave one man unconscious and the other facing assault charges. But what happened next defied everyone's expectations and challenged their assumptions about violent strength and the nature of true martial skill. Seagal moved with such fluid precision that his response seemed almost choreographed. Yet there was nothing theatrical about the economy of motion he displayed. Every movement had been refined through decades of training and real-world application until it had become as natural as breathing, as instinctive as blinking. His body shifted perhaps 6 inches to the left, his head tilting slightly as Terry's fist whistled harmlessly past his ear, creating a rush of air that disturbed not a single strand of his long silver hair. The movement was so minimal, so effortless, that for a moment it seemed like Terry had simply missed his target, like his aim had been off or his timing poor. But those with trained eyes could see the perfection in Seagal's evasion, the way he had read Terry's telegraph, the subtle weight shift that had preceded the attack, the micro-expressions that had revealed the former fighter's intentions before Terry himself was fully conscious of them. Terry's momentum carried him forward past Seagal, leaving him off balance and grasping at empty air. His confusion evident as he spun around to face his target again, his breathing already labored from the adrenaline surge that had flooded his system. The moment he committed to violence, his eyes were wide with disbelief as he tried to process what had just happened. How someone who appeared to be sitting calmly at a diner counter could have moved with such perfect timing and precision that what should have been a devastating blow had become nothing more than an embarrassing display of poor judgment and worse execution. "You got lucky, old man." Terry panted, his confidence shaken, but his pride demanding he continue the assault that was just a warm-up. He reset his stance, bouncing on the balls of his feet in a display of footwork that might have been impressive against a lesser opponent, but looked clumsy and predictable to someone who had spent a lifetime studying the subtle tells that preceded every human movement. The sweat that had begun to bead on Terry's forehead wasn't entirely from physical exertion. There was something else there now, a growing recognition that he might have made a terrible miscalculation in choosing this particular fight. Ruby had pressed herself against the kitchen door, her hand clutching the phone, but something in Seagal's demeanor kept her from dialing the police. There was no panic in his posture, no fear in his eyes, just a calm readiness that suggested he was completely in control of the situation, that he had been in similar circumstances many times before, and knew exactly how to handle them without causing unnecessary harm to anyone involved, including Terry himself, who, despite his aggression, was clearly a man in pain rather than a truly dangerous criminal. The difference was important, and Seagal's years of experience in law enforcement had taught him to recognize the distinction between someone who was evil and someone who was simply lost, confused, and lashing out at a world that no longer seemed to make sense or offer any place for the person they used to be. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ed Reynolds had half risen from his booth, his hand gripping his cane not as a weapon but as a potential tool for maintaining his balance if he needed to move quickly to protect Martha or assist in restoring order. But something in Seagal's complete composure suggested that intervention might not be necessary, that this situation was being handled by someone who possessed not only the physical skills to neutralize threats, but the wisdom to know when and how to apply those skills in ways that served justice, rather than simply demonstrating dominance. Martha's gentle touch on his arm reminded him that sometimes the most courageous thing a person could do was trust others to handle situations that were beyond their own abilities to control or resolve, and that faith in the goodness of human nature was often rewarded when you had the patience to let events unfold according to their own natural rhythm. Old Pete had abandoned all pretense of reading his newspaper, his eyes wide with fascination at witnessing what might be the most excitement Aspen Heights had seen in decades, but also with growing admiration for the way Seagal was handling himself. Under pressure, the old man had served in Korea, had seen his share of violence and combat, but he had never witnessed anyone who could remain so perfectly calm in the face of aggression while still maintaining the alert readiness that suggested he was prepared for whatever might come next. It was the kind of self-control that could only come from years of training and experience, but also from a deep understanding of what violence really cost and why it should always be a last resort, rather than a first response to conflict or disrespect. The truck drivers had positioned themselves near the door ready to flee or help, depending on how the situation developed. But they too were beginning to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a fight between two men, but a masterclass in conflict resolution, from someone who had clearly spent a lifetime learning how to diffuse dangerous situations without resorting to the kind of brutality that usually characterized such encounters. Jake, the older of the two drivers, had been in his share of truck stop brawls and knew the difference between someone who was all talk and someone who could back up their words with action. But he had never seen anyone quite like Seagal, who seemed to radiate a kind of quiet confidence that was more intimidating than any amount of chest thumping or aggressive posturing could ever be. Toby peered out from the kitchen, his teenage mind struggling to process the reality of watching a real fight unfold before his eyes, rather than on a screen, but also beginning to understand that this wasn't like the movies where conflict was resolved through spectacular displays of violence and the good guys always won because they hit harder than the bad guys. This was something different, something more complex and nuanced, where the real victory might come, not from defeating an opponent, but from helping him understand that he didn't need to be an opponent at all, that there were other ways to resolve whatever internal conflicts were driving him to seek validation through aggression and intimidation. Terry launched himself forward again this time, attempting a combination of punches that would have overwhelmed most opponents. His left hook followed by a right cross and finishing with an uppercut that had once knocked out a ranked contender in Las Vegas. But Seagal seemed to anticipate each strike before Terry even threw it. His movements were economical, almost lazy, as he swayed back from the hook, let the cross slide past his shoulder, and stepped inside the uppercut's arc, leaving Terry once again punching air but now breathing even harder, and showing signs of real fatigue as the adrenaline that had initially fueled his aggression began to fade, leaving behind the cold reality that he was exhausting himself against someone who hadn't even been forced to break a sweat. The former MMA fighter's eyes widened with disbelief and growing panic as he realized he was facing someone operating on a completely different level, someone who had transcended the crude application of physical force and achieved something approaching artistry in the way he moved and responded to threats. This isn't possible. Terry gasped, his chest heaving from exertion, his carefully maintained image of physical superiority crumbling with each failed attempt to land a blow. "You're just an old man, you can't be this fast." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true, that age and speed had nothing to do with what he was witnessing. That this was about something deeper than reflexes or conditioning. This was about a fundamental understanding of combat and conflict that went far beyond anything he had learned in the octagon or the gym. This was about reading people, understanding their intentions before they understood them themselves, and responding not with overwhelming force, but with precisely the amount of intervention necessary to neutralize a threat without causing unnecessary harm. Seagal remained silent, his dark eyes never leaving Terry's face, reading every micro-expression, every tell that preceded each attack. His decades of training in multiple martial arts disciplines had taught him that the most dangerous opponent was often the one who appeared calm in the storm of violence, who could remain centered and focused while chaos swirled around them. But he had also learned that sometimes the most important victory was not the one you achieved over an external enemy, but the one you helped someone else achieve over their own inner demons, their own fears and insecurities and misconceptions about what it meant to be strong or worthy of respect. The third exchange proved to be Terry's undoing, driven by desperation and wounded pride. He abandoned all technique and simply charged forward like a bull, hoping to use his size and weight to overwhelm his opponent. But Seagal had been expecting. This move had seen it countless times in his years of law enforcement and martial arts training, where desperate people inevitably resorted to the most primitive tactics when more sophisticated approaches failed to produce the results they needed. As Terry barreled toward him, Seagal stepped to the side with matador-like timing, extending one foot just enough to catch Terry's ankle. Not to trip him maliciously, but to help his own momentum work against him in a way that would end the confrontation, without causing serious injury. The former fighter's own forward motion became his enemy, as he stumbled forward, unable to stop his charge, his hands windmilling frantically as he fought to maintain balance. But physics and gravity had already taken over, and there was nothing left to do but fall. The crash, when it came, was spectacular. Terry's body hit the floor with enough force to rattle the windows, his weight distributed across the worn linoleum in an undignified sprawl that drew involuntary winces from the watching crowd. The sound of his impact seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed, broken only by Terry's labored breathing and the distant hum of the ceiling fans that continued their lazy rotation above the scene of this unlikely confrontation. The contrast between the violence of his fall and the peaceful normalcy of the diner's continuing operation served as a powerful reminder that life went on regardless of individual dramas, and that the world was much larger than any one person's need for validation or recognition. Terry lay on the cold linoleum floor of Betty's diner, staring up at the water-stained ceiling tiles as the reality of his situation slowly penetrated the fog of his humiliation and disbelief. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh and unforgiving, casting shadows that made the familiar diner feel alien and hostile around him, transforming a place that should have been welcoming into something that felt like a courtroom where he was both defendant and evidence of his own failures. The sounds of the establishment, the gentle hum of conversation, the clink of silverware against plates, the soft footsteps of Ruby checking on her customers, all seemed muffled and distant, as if he were hearing them through thick glass, or from the bottom of a deep well that he had somehow fallen into without realizing how far he had descended from the person he used to be, or thought he was. His body ached not from any blow Seagal had delivered, but from the impact of his own momentum against the unforgiving floor, a perfect metaphor for how his own aggression had been turned against him, how his desperate attempt to prove his worth had only demonstrated how far he had fallen from any meaningful definition of strength or dignity. The pain was both physical and existential, radiating outward from the points where his body had struck the linoleum, but also inward toward the core of his identity, where the most fundamental questions about who he was and what he had become were finally demanding answers that he could no longer avoid or deflect with anger and blame directed at external targets that had never really been responsible for his problems in the first place. His breathing gradually slowed from the ragged gasps of exertion to something approaching normal, though each breath carried with it a weight of realization he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge, yet the weight of understanding that this moment represented something more than just another failed fight or public embarrassment, that it was actually a crossroads, where he could choose to continue down the path of self-destruction and blame that had brought him to this point, or begin the much more difficult journey toward becoming someone different, someone better, someone who could look at himself in the mirror without feeling disgusted by what he saw reflected there. The choice was his, and his alone, but making it would require a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed, the courage to admit that everything he had believed about strength and respect and what it meant to be a man had been fundamentally wrong. Seagal moved with the same fluid grace he had displayed throughout the confrontation, stepping around Terry's prone form to retrieve his coffee cup. The action was neither mocking nor dismissive, simply practical, as if stepping around obstacles was just another part of his daily routine, something he had done so many times that it required no special attention or commentary. The fact that he could treat this moment with such matter-of-fact calm, while Terry felt like his entire world was collapsing, only emphasized the vast difference in their perspectives and their understanding of what had actually taken place here. This wasn't a victory or a defeat. In any traditional sense, it was something more complex and potentially more meaningful. If Terry could find the wisdom to recognize it and learn from it. He took a measured sip, his dark eyes never leaving Terry's face, but there was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at having bested a younger, stronger opponent. Instead, there was something that looked almost like compassion, mixed with the patience of someone who had witnessed this same scene play out countless times before, who understood that the real battle wasn't between two men in a diner, but between one man and his own demons, his own fears and misconceptions and desperate need for validation from external sources that could never really provide the kind of lasting satisfaction that came from internal peace and self-acceptance. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had maintained throughout their encounter. "You're at a crossroads right now. You can lie there feeling sorry for yourself, making excuses about why things didn't go your way, or you can take this opportunity to learn something about yourself and about what real strength actually means." The words hit Terry with more force than any physical blow could have, because they carried the weight of truth that was impossible to deny or rationalize away. He had been making excuses for years, blaming judges and promoters and bad luck and everything else he could think of for the decline of his career, when the real problem had been his inability to accept that time moved on, that younger fighters emerged, that staying on top required constant evolution and adaptation rather than just relying on past achievements and the reputation they had built in better times. Terry's first instinct was to lash out to reject any wisdom this man might offer. But something in Seagal's tone, something in the complete absence of mockery or condescension made him listen instead of reacting, made him consider the possibility that maybe this stranger might have something valuable to teach him about life and choices and the kind of strength that lasted long after physical abilities began to fade. The diner patrons watched this exchange with fascination, mixed with respect for the gravity of the moment they were witnessing. Ruby had emerged from her position by the kitchen door and now stood nearby, her hand no longer hovering over the phone, her expression mixing concern for Terry's physical well-being with curiosity about what would happen next. Whether this would be just another story about a troublemaker getting his comeuppance or something more meaningful about redemption and the possibility of change that existed even in the most unlikely circumstances and people who seemed most resistant to growth and self-improvement. Ed and Martha Reynolds remained in their booth, but both were leaning forward slightly, their quiet dignity intact but their interest obvious in the way they observed this unexpected turn of events, understanding from their own long experience with life that moments of genuine transformation often came disguised as moments of apparent defeat. Old Pete had abandoned his newspaper entirely, his weathered hands folded in front of him as he witnessed what might be the most memorable Sunday afternoon of his life. Not because of the drama or excitement, but because of the human truth being revealed in the aftermath of conflict the way that real learning often happened, not in moments of triumph, but in moments of humility when pride was stripped away and a person was forced to confront the reality of who they actually were versus who they thought they were, or wanted others to believe they were. The truck drivers whispered quietly to each other, their voices carrying notes of amazement at what they had just seen, but also recognition that they were continuing to witness something important that wasn't over yet, even though the physical confrontation had ended. Even Toby had crept further out of the kitchen, his teenage fascination with conflict now tempered by the sobering reality of watching a man confront his own limitations in such a public manner, understanding for perhaps the first time that real fights weren't like the movies where everything was resolved with spectacular action sequences and clear winners and losers, but were actually about much deeper issues of identity and purpose, and the search for meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to individual struggles and aspirations. The dishwasher job that had seemed so important earlier now felt trivial compared to the human drama unfolding before his eyes. Terry struggled to push himself up into a sitting position, his movements clumsy and uncertain as his body protested the abuse it had just endured, but also as his mind wrestled with concepts and possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. His pride, the thing that had driven him to this moment, now felt like a lead weight in his chest, making even the simple act of sitting upright feel like an insurmountable challenge, because admitting that he had been wrong about so many things for so long required a kind of strength he had never needed in the octagon, where problems could be solved with training and technique and the application of physical force to overcome obstacles that were ultimately external and temporary. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse and strained, not just from the physical exertion but from the emotional toll of having his defenses stripped away so completely. "I used to be somebody. People knew my name. They feared me when I walked into a room." The words came out in a rush, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else, trying to hold on to some vestige of the identity that had defined him for so long, even though he was beginning to realize that identity had been built on foundations that were far less solid than he had believed. "I had everything: money, fame, respect. And then it all fell apart. One loss led to another, and another, until nobody wanted to see Terry the Titan fight anymore, until the only calls I got were from promoters looking for someone to beat up their rising stars. I became the guy they brought in to lose, to make other people look good." His voice cracked on the last words, the admission seeming to physically pain him as it left his lips, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it had never quite accomplished. Seagal nodded slowly, his expression showing understanding rather than judgment, recognition of the pain behind Terry's words without any attempt to minimize or dismiss it, because he had seen enough of life to know that everyone carried their own burdens, their own disappointments, their own struggles with identity and purpose that might not be visible from the outside, but were no less real for being hidden. "I've seen it before," he said, settling into a crouch so he could speak to Terry at eye level, treating him not as a defeated opponent but as a fellow human being deserving of respect and consideration. Men who built their entire identity around being the toughest, the strongest, the most feared, and then life teaches them that nobody stays on top forever. That time moves on, that younger, stronger people emerge, that the only constant in life is change, and the only question is whether you adapt to it or let it destroy you. The question isn't whether you'll face that lesson. The question is what you do when it comes. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing, his voice gentle but firm. You can spend the rest of your life trying to recapture something that's already gone, fighting smaller and smaller battles against weaker and weaker opponents until you become a caricature of what you used to be. Or you can accept that real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself, about knowing when to fight and when to walk away, about using your power to protect rather than to intimidate, about finding ways to build people up instead of tearing them down. Terry's eyes filled with tears. He was desperate to hold back the truth of Seagal's words, cutting through decades of denial and self-deception, like a blade through tissue, exposing wounds that had been festering for years, but also creating the possibility that those wounds might finally begin to heal if he had the courage to tend to them properly. "But I don't know how to be anything else," Terry whispered, his voice so quiet that only Seagal could hear him, the admission carrying more vulnerability than any physical defeat could have inflicted. "Fighting is all I've ever been good at. It's the only thing that ever made me feel like I mattered, like I was worth something. And now even that's gone. What's left of me when I can't fight anymore?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with despair, but also with the possibility of discovery. Because sometimes the most important journey began with admitting that you were lost, that the map you had been following no longer led anywhere you wanted to go, and that finding a new direction required help from someone who had traveled different roads and learned different lessons about what it meant to live a meaningful life. Seagal's expression softened with genuine compassion as he recognized the depth of Terry's crisis. This wasn't just about a washed-up fighter causing trouble in a diner. This was about a human being who had lost his sense of purpose and was drowning in the void left behind by the collapse of everything he had believed about himself and his place in the world. "You're asking the wrong question," Seagal replied, his voice gentle but firm. "You're asking what's left, when you should be asking what's possible. You spent years learning how to hurt people. Now you could spend years learning how to help them. You know what it feels like to be beaten down, to feel like you're not worth anything. Maybe that experience could help someone else who's going through the same thing. Maybe the pain you've experienced could become a source of wisdom and compassion that could make a real difference in someone else's life." The seed of an idea seemed to take root in Terry's mind as he considered Seagal's words, his expression shifting from despair towards something that might have been hope, if he had the courage to nurture it. The possibility that his failures and pain might not be meaningless, that they might actually be preparation for something better, something more meaningful than anything he had achieved in his fighting career, began to glow like a small flame in the darkness of his confusion and self-doubt. It was a fragile possibility, easily extinguished by cynicism or fear, but also potentially powerful enough to light the way toward a completely different kind of life, if he could find the strength to protect it and help it grow into something substantial and lasting. Terry remained sitting on the linoleum floor for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it was probably only a few minutes, the weight of Seagal's words settling into his consciousness. Like sediment in still water around him, the diner had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though every patron remained acutely aware of his presence. The truck drivers had resumed their quiet conversation, but their eyes kept drifting his way. Old Pete had picked up his newspaper again, but wasn't really reading it. Ruby moved between tables with practiced efficiency, but her movements carried a new tension, as if she were walking on eggshells. Toby had retreated partially back into the kitchen, but his head still peeked out periodically to check On the situation, Ed and Martha Reynolds sat in their booth, the picture of quiet dignity. But their meal remained largely untouched, as they too processed what they had witnessed. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows seemed different, now somehow more golden and forgiving, as if even the light understood that something profound had shifted in this small space. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried weight, the kind of pregnant pause that occurs when everyone in a room knows they've witnessed something significant, but nobody quite knows how to process it. Yet Terry found himself studying the pattern in the worn linoleum beneath him, noticing details he'd never paid attention to before. The way the light caught the scratches and scuffs that told the story of thousands of meals served, thousands of conversations shared, thousands of small moments that made up the life of this humble establishment. He could see coffee stains that had been scrubbed, but never quite removed completely, witness marks of spilled cream and dropped sugar packets, the accumulated evidence of human interaction, in all its messy, imperfect glory. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself thinking about something other than his own pain, his own failures, his own desperate need to matter to someone somewhere. The realization came slowly at first, like dawn, breaking over a landscape you thought you knew but suddenly see with new eyes. He had been so focused on what he had lost, his championship opportunities, his sponsorships, his fame, his identity as Terry, the Titan, that he had never stopped to consider what he might still have. What he might still become. The man sitting across from him had shown him something profound. Without ever raising his voice or his fists, had demonstrated that real power came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that ability. Seagal had neutralized him completely without causing him any real harm, had made his point without humiliating him more than Terry had already humiliated himself, and in doing so had opened a door that Terry hadn't even known existed, a door to a different way of being in the world. With great effort, Terry pushed himself up from the floor, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were learning to walk again. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, not from any physical injury but from the psychological impact of having his entire worldview challenged in the span of a few minutes. He stood there swaying slightly as he looked around the diner, seeing it as if for the first time. The worn but clean tables, the faded photographs of local history hanging on the walls, the simple, honest atmosphere of a place where people came not to impress anyone, but simply to share a meal and some conversation. It struck him suddenly how his entrance had violated this peaceful sanctuary, how his need to prove himself had poisoned the air for everyone present. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he found himself wondering when he had become the kind of person who brought chaos into places that deserved peace. When had his pain become an excuse to cause pain to others? When had his quest for respect turned into a campaign of intimidation against people who had done nothing to deserve his wrath? The weight of these questions threatened to crush him, but instead of running from them as he had done so many times before, Terry found himself embracing them, letting them wash over him like a cleansing rain. He thought about all the times he had picked fights in bars and gyms and parking lots, all the times he had used his size and training to intimidate people who couldn't fight back, all the times he had told himself he was just demanding the respect he deserved, when really he was just a broken man lashing out at a world that had moved on without him. The pattern was so clear now, so obvious, that he wondered how he had missed it for so long. Every confrontation had been the same story, him trying to recapture a feeling of power and significance that belonged to a different time, a different version of himself that no longer existed and perhaps never really had. Seagal had returned to his position at the counter, his coffee cup cradled in both hands as he watched Terry's internal struggle with patient eyes. He made no move to hurry the younger man's decision, offered no additional words of wisdom or encouragement, understanding that some lessons could only be learned in silence, that the most important conversations were often the ones people had with themselves in moments of crisis and clarity. Terry looked around the diner one more time, his gaze lingering. On each face he had disrupted, each person whose quiet Sunday afternoon he had turned into a spectacle of violence and aggression. When his eyes met those of Ed Reynolds, the elderly veteran offered him something unexpected, not the condemnation Terry felt he deserved, but a slight nod of understanding, the look of one man who had faced his own demons recognizing another who was just beginning to confront his. The simple gesture nearly broke Terry's remaining composure, but it also gave him the strength to do what he knew he had to do. Moving slowly, Terry walked to the counter where Ruby stood behind the register, her expression cautious but not unkind. Her years of working in customer service had taught her to read people to recognize when someone was genuinely sorry, versus when they were just going through the motions, and something in Terry's demeanor now told her that whatever transformation was happening inside him was real and profound. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, placing it on the scarred formica surface with hands that trembled slightly for the coffee. He said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, and for the trouble Ruby looked at the money, then at him, her expression softening as she recognized genuine remorse. When she saw it, "Keep it," she said, gently pushing the bill back toward him. But Terry shook his head. "No, ma'am," he insisted, the formal address surprising them both. "I need to pay my way from now on." It was a small gesture, but it carried weight beyond its monetary value, a symbolic recognition that actions have consequences, and that making amends had to start somewhere, even if it was just with a cup of coffee and an apology to a waitress who had done nothing wrong except try to keep the peace in her workplace. As Terry turned to leave, he paused near the Reynolds booth, his feet seeming to move of their own accord, bringing him face to face with the couple he had so cruelly tormented just minutes earlier, though it felt like a lifetime ago. Ed looked up at him with those steady eyes that had seen combat and chaos and had learned to find calm in the storm. Martha's hand rested on her husband's arm, a gesture of support and solidarity that spoke of decades of partnership through good times and bad. Their quiet dignity in the face of his aggression had been more powerful than any angry response could have been, and Terry found himself humbled by their grace under pressure. "I owe you folks an apology," Terry said, his voice stronger now, though still heavy with emotion. "What I did here today was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. You were just trying to enjoy your meal, and I made it about my own problems. That wasn't right. And I'm sorry." The words came from somewhere deep inside him, from a place he had forgotten existed, a place where his conscience still lived, despite years of being buried under anger and self-pity. Ed studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance of the apology and recognition of the courage it had taken to offer it. "We all have our battles, son," Ed said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of years. "Just make sure you're fighting the right ones." The simple words hit Terry with more force than any punch he had ever taken in the octagon, because they carried truth that he couldn't deny, couldn't rationalize away, couldn't blame on bad judges or corrupt promoters or any of the other excuses he had used to avoid looking at himself honestly. Martha smiled at him, then a gentle expression that held no trace of fear or resentment despite what he had put them through, and Terry realized that this was what strength really looked like, not the ability to hurt others but the grace to forgive them even when they didn't deserve it. The simple exchange seemed to lift some invisible weight from Terry's shoulders, and he found himself standing a little straighter as he made his way toward the door. The afternoon sun streaming through the window seemed brighter now, warming his face as he prepared to step back into the world as a different man than the one who had entered Betty's diner looking for a fight. Seagal watched him go, offering a small nod when their eyes met briefly at the threshold. There was no triumph in the gesture, no sense of victory, just acknowledgement between two men who understood that real battles were often fought within oneself. The door chime seemed softer somehow, as Terry stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, the sound marking not just his physical departure, but his first step toward becoming someone different than the man who had entered Betty's diner looking for a fight behind him. The establishment began to settle back into its natural rhythm, the peaceful Sunday afternoon, reasserting itself like water flowing back into a space where a stone had been removed. The silence that followed Terry's departure was different from the tense quiet that had gripped the diner during the confrontation. This was a peaceful settling, a collective exhale as the patrons processed what they had witnessed and slowly returned to their interrupted Sunday routines. But it was more than just a return to normalcy. It was a recognition that they had all been part of something significant, something that would stay with them long after the coffee cups were cleared and the tables wiped down. Ruby was the first to move, gathering up the cup Terry had barely touched and wiping down the counter where he had sat. Her movements were automatic, practiced, but there was a thoughtfulness to them, as if she were trying to erase Not just the physical evidence of his presence, but the negative energy he had brought into her workplace. Though as she worked, she found herself thinking that maybe erasing wasn't the right word. Maybe what had happened here needed to be remembered, not as a cautionary tale about violence and aggression, but as a story about redemption and the possibility of change. Old Pete folded his newspaper with deliberate care, then looked around the diner as if seeing it with new eyes. The familiar space seemed somehow more precious now. Having been threatened and then restored to its natural state, he had been coming. To Betty's for over 15 years had witnessed countless small dramas and minor conflicts, but nothing quite like what had just unfolded before his eyes. The way that martial artist had handled the situation without resorting to violence had been something to behold. Pete had served in Korea, had seen his share of fights, and knew the difference between someone who talked tough and someone who actually was tough. But more than that, he had recognized something in the way Seagal carried himself, a kind of quiet confidence that came not from needing to prove anything, but from knowing exactly who you were and what you stood for. It was the kind of strength Pete had always admired but rarely seen in action. The truck drivers resumed their conversation, but their voices carried a different quality, now tinged with the shared experience of having witnessed something remarkable. Jake, the older of the two, had been driving long-haul routes for over 20 years, had stopped at diners and truck stops across the country and had seen his share of trouble, but he had never seen anything quite like what had just happened. "You see how that old guy handled that hothead?" he said to his partner Mike, shaking. His head in amazement didn't throw a single punch but completely shut him down. "That's some serious skill right there." Mike nodded in agreement, but he was thinking about something else, about the way Terry had looked when he was leaving, like a man who had just woken up from a long nightmare and wasn't sure where he was but was grateful to be awake. Both men had been in their share of fights, had used their fists to settle disputes more times than they cared to admit, but something about what they had witnessed made them reconsider the wisdom of that approach. Ed Reynolds reached across the table and squeezed his wife's hand, a gesture that had become second nature over their 52 years of marriage, but which carried extra meaning. Now Martha returned the pressure, understanding passing between them. Without words, they had seen enough of life to recognize when someone was at a turning point, and they had just watched a man choose between destruction and redemption. The choice hadn't been dramatic or cinematic, just a quiet decision to walk away and try to do better, and somehow that made it more powerful than any grand gesture could have been. Martha picked up her fork and took a bite of the peach cobbler that had grown cold during the confrontation. "It's still good," she said with a small smile, the simple statement carrying layers of meaning about resilience and the ability to find sweetness even after bitter experiences. Ed smiled back at her, his love for this woman who had stood by him through war and peace, prosperity and struggle, shining in his eyes. She had shown such grace under pressure, such dignity in the face of Terry's cruel taunts, that he felt proud all over again to call her his wife. Steven Seagal finished his coffee in contemplative silence, his dark eyes occasionally scanning the diner, but mostly focused inward on thoughts and memories that only he could access. He had intervened in countless conflicts over the years, both as a martial artist and as a law enforcement officer, but each one taught him something new about human nature and the complex motivations that drove people to violence or away from it. Terry's story was not unique. There were thousands of men and women struggling with lost identity, failed dreams, and the desperate need to matter to someone somewhere. But what made each case different was the moment of choice, the instant when a person could decide to continue down a destructive path or turn toward something better. Seagal had learned long ago that he couldn't make that choice for anyone. He could only create the conditions where the choice became clear and hope that the person had enough wisdom or desperation to choose correctly. The fact that Terry had walked away, had apologized, had shown genuine remorse, suggested that despite all his anger and pain, there was still something salvageable in him, still a core of decency that could be rebuilt upon. Ruby approached his section of the counter, refilling his cup without being asked her movements, carrying the easy familiarity of someone who had been serving coffee for years. But her expression was thoughtful. That was something else, she said quietly. Not quite a question, but an invitation for him to share his perspective if he chose to. Seagal nodded slowly, sipping the fresh coffee before responding. "Everyone's fighting something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Some people fight the world. Some fight other people, but the hardest fight is the one you have with yourself. He paused, watching the steam rise from his cup. That young man has been running from himself for a long time. Maybe today he finally stopped running, long enough to look in the mirror. Ruby considered this, nodding slowly as she processed the wisdom in his words. She had seen enough troubled souls pass through the diner over the years to recognize the truth in what he said. There was something about working in a place like this that gave you insight into human nature. People came here when they were happy, when they were sad, when they were celebrating, when they were grieving. And over time, you learned to read the signs, to understand what drove people to act the way they did. In the corner booth, the young couple who had been quietly eating throughout the entire confrontation finally relaxed enough to resume their conversation, their voices low but animated as they discussed what they had witnessed. Sarah, the woman, kept glancing toward the door as if expecting Terry to return, while her boyfriend David seemed more focused on Seagal, clearly impressed by the way he had handled the situation without resorting to violence. Their youth made the events seem more dramatic, more significant than they might have appeared to older eyes, but that didn't diminish the impact of what they had seen. Sometimes, the most important lessons came when you weren't looking for them, wrapped in ordinary moments that revealed extraordinary truths about courage, integrity, and the strength that came from choosing peace over conflict. Sarah found herself thinking about her own tendency to solve problems with sharp words and wounded feelings, while David reflected on the times he had let his temper get the better of him in arguments with friends and family. Both of them recognized that they had just received a masterclass in conflict resolution, though neither could have articulated exactly what they had learned. Toby emerged fully from the kitchen, now that the danger had passed his teenage mind, still processing the reality of having witnessed an actual confrontation rather than the sanitized violence of movies or video games. He moved around the diner, collecting plates and refilling water glasses, his usual clumsiness tempered by a new awareness of how quickly peaceful situations could turn dangerous and how much skill it took to restore that peace. The dishwater and broken plates that had seemed so important earlier now felt trivial compared to the human drama that had unfolded in the dining room. He found himself looking at the regular customers with new eyes, seeing them not just as sources of tips and small talk, but as people with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own quiet acts of courage that went unnoticed by the world, but mattered immensely to those who witnessed them. The diner felt different now, charged with possibility and hope despite the conflict that had threatened to tear apart its peaceful Sunday afternoon rhythm. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its lazy journey across the sky, casting long shadows that grew longer as the day progressed. Inside, Betty's diner life went on, much as it always had, but with a subtle difference in the quality of the silence, a deeper appreciation for the peace that usually reigned here, and a newfound understanding among the patrons that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought not with fists or weapons, but with patience, wisdom, and the courage to choose forgiveness over revenge, understanding over judgment, hope over despair. The story of what had happened here would be told and retold in the days and weeks to come, but already it was becoming something more than just an account of a fight. That didn't happen. It was becoming a parable about the better angels of human nature, and the possibility that even the most lost souls could find their way home if someone cared enough to show them the path. 3 weeks had passed since that transformative Sunday afternoon at Betty's diner, and the town of Aspen Heights had settled back into its familiar rhythms, though the story of what had happened between Terry Kline and Steven Seagal had taken on a life of its own, told and retold in barbershops and beauty salons, at the post office and the gas station, each telling, adding new details or interpretations until it had become something approaching local legend. But for those who had actually witnessed the events, the memory remained sharp and clear, a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in life arrived without warning, wrapped in the ordinary packaging of a Sunday afternoon meal, and that courage could manifest in unexpected ways through unexpected people who chose wisdom over violence, understanding over judgment, and redemption over revenge. On this particular morning, Ruby was going through her usual opening routine at Betty's diner, unlocking the front door, turning on the lights, starting the coffee makers, and preparing for another day of serving the good people of Aspen Heights. But as she worked, she found herself glancing frequently out the front window, watching for a particular figure who'd been making regular appearances over the past week. Terry Kline had returned to town not with the swagger and aggression that had marked his previous visit, but with a quiet humility that spoke of genuine change. He had taken a job at Miller's Construction, working long hours, doing physical labor that was honest if not glamorous, and in the evenings he had begun volunteering at the youth center, helping kids with their homework and occasionally sharing stories about the importance of making good choices and learning from mistakes. The transformation had not been immediate or dramatic. There had been no sudden revelation, no moment of blinding clarity that instantly changed everything. Instead, it had been a gradual process of small decisions and tiny steps toward becoming the person Terry wanted to be rather than the person his pain and anger had made him. He had started by finding a cheap motel room on the outskirts of town, then had looked for work that would allow him to earn an honest living without trading on his former fame or intimidating anyone into giving him opportunities he didn't deserve. The construction job had been perfect, hard physical work that left him too tired to dwell on his grievances and gave him a sense of accomplishment that came from building something rather than tearing it down. The youth center had been Ruby's suggestion when Terry had stopped by the diner one evening looking lost and uncertain about how to spend his time, now that he wasn't filling his days with anger and confrontation. She had mentioned that the center was always looking for volunteers, especially people who could relate to kids who were struggling with their own problems. And while Terry had initially been skeptical about his ability to help anyone given his own recent history of poor choices, he had eventually worked up the courage to stop by and speak with the director, a patient woman named Carol Martinez, who had worked with troubled youth for over 15 years, and knew better than most that sometimes the best mentors were people who had made mistakes and learned from them. Carol had been cautious at first, having heard about Terry's reputation and his recent confrontation at the diner, but she had also heard about how that confrontation had ended and about the changes people were noticing in him. And after a long conversation in which Terry was refreshingly honest about his struggles with anger and his desire to find a better way to live, she had agreed to let him start with small tasks, helping with homework supervision and basic maintenance around the facility. The center served kids from all walks of life, but many of them came from broken homes or difficult circumstances, and Carol believed that Terry's journey from anger to acceptance might resonate with young people who were facing their own battles with frustration and hopelessness. The first few sessions had been awkward. Terry unsure of how to talk to the kids, and they unsure of what to make of this large, quiet man who seemed so different from the other volunteers. But gradually connections began to form. One of the first breakthroughs came with a 15-year-old named Marcus Williams, who had been getting into fights at school and was on the verge of being expelled. Marcus was angry at the world, convinced that everyone was against him, and that the only way to get respect was through intimidation and violence. Terry recognized something familiar in the boy's attitude, and after several conversations began to share his own story, not the sanitized version he might have told to protect his image, but the real story about how his anger had cost him everything he cared about, and how he was only now beginning to understand what real strength actually meant. Marcus had been skeptical at first, dismissing Terry as just another adult, trying to lecture him about choices and consequences. But something in Terry's honesty, something in the way he admitted his own failures without trying to excuse them, began to crack through the boy's defenses. Terry didn't preach or pontificate. He simply shared his experiences and let Marcus draw his own conclusions. And slowly the angry teenager began to see that the path he was on led nowhere good, that the respect he thought he was earning through fighting was actually just fear. And that fear always faded, leaving nothing behind but emptiness and regret. The transformation in Marcus wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable enough that other kids began to pay attention to what Terry was saying, and gradually he found himself becoming a trusted figure at the center, someone the kids could talk to about their problems without feeling judged or lectured. Meanwhile, the regular patrons of Betty's Diner had been watching Terry's gradual rehabilitation with interest and varying degrees of skepticism. Some were impressed by his apparent commitment to change, while others remained cautious, waiting to see if this new humility was genuine or just another performance designed to win sympathy and acceptance. But Ruby, who saw him almost daily as he stopped by for coffee before work or after his volunteer sessions, was becoming convinced that the change was real. There was something different in his eyes now, a peace that hadn't been there before, and a way of carrying himself that spoke of someone who was no longer at war with the world or with himself. Ed and Martha Reynolds had encountered Terry twice since that Sunday afternoon, both times at the grocery store, where their paths had crossed in the produce section on the first occasion. Terry had simply nodded respectfully and moved on clearly, not wanting to intrude on their shopping, but on the second encounter, Martha had approached him and struck up a conversation asking about his work at the construction site and his volunteer activities at the youth center. Terry had answered her questions, honestly sharing that he was trying to find ways to give back to the community and make amends for his past behavior. Though he was careful not to burden her with too many details about his personal struggles, Martha had listened with the kind attention she gave to everyone, treating him not as a former troublemaker, trying to rehabilitate his image, but as a neighbor who was working to better himself and his community. Ed had joined the conversation as they were finishing talking, and had offered Terry something unexpected, an invitation to join him for coffee sometime if he was interested in talking with someone who had experienced his own share of struggles. With anger and purpose after leaving the military, Terry had been moved almost to tears by the gesture, understanding that this man whom he had treated so poorly was offering not just forgiveness, but friendship and mentorship. It was an offer that spoke volumes about Ed's character and about the kind of grace that came from years of learning to separate the person from their actions, to see potential for good even in those who had lost their way. The youth center had organized a community basketball tournament for the following weekend, and Carol had asked Terry if he would be willing to help coach one of the teams made up of kids who had been struggling academically or socially. The idea terrified him, not because he was afraid of the responsibility, but because he knew that many in the community would be watching to see how he handled himself in a situation that could easily become competitive and heated. The old Terry would have seen this as an opportunity to prove his toughness, to show these kids what a real winner looked like. But the new Terry understood that his role was to teach them something more valuable than how to win games, how to win at life through persistence, respect for others, and the kind of quiet strength that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. As Terry sat in his motel room that evening, preparing for another day of honest work and meaningful volunteer service, he reflected on how different his life had become and how much Seagal's intervention had meant to him. The martial artist had shown him something profound that day, something about the difference between power and strength, between dominance and leadership, between demanding respect and earning it. And while Terry knew he still had a long way to go in his journey toward becoming the man he wanted to be, he also knew that he was finally moving in the right direction, no longer running from his problems or trying to solve them with his fists, but facing them head-on with the kind of courage that came from admitting your mistakes and working every day to do better than you did the day before. 6 months had passed since that pivotal Sunday afternoon at Betty's Diner, and the small town of Aspen Heights had witnessed a quiet miracle in the transformation of Terry Kline, from a man consumed by anger and desperate for validation into someone who had found purpose in service to others and peace in accepting responsibility for his own choices. The change had not gone unnoticed by the community, and while some remained skeptical about the permanence of his rehabilitation, most had come to accept that whatever had happened in that diner had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his life in ways that benefited not just Terry himself, but everyone whose life he touched through his work with troubled youth and his commitment to being a positive presence in their small town. The youth center had become the focal point of Terry's new life, and under Carol Martinez's guidance, he had developed into one of their most effective mentors, particularly with kids who were struggling with anger management and impulse control. His approach was unique among the volunteers because he never lectured or preached about the importance of making good choices. Instead, he simply shared his own story with brutal honesty, admitting his failures and describing the consequences of letting anger drive his decisions. The kids responded to this authenticity in ways that surprised even Carol. They could sense that Terry wasn't talking down to them from some position of moral superiority, but speaking to them as someone who had walked the same dark paths they were walking and had found a way back to the light. Marcus Williams, who had been Terry's first real success story at the center, had not only avoided expulsion from school, but had become something of a leader among his peers, helping other kids work through their own anger issues and serving as a living example that change was possible even for those who seemed most lost. Marcus had started a peer counseling group that met twice a week after school, and had asked Terry to serve as the adult supervisor, a role that Terry approached with the same humility and commitment he brought to everything else in his new life. The group had grown from 3 founding members to over a dozen kids who came not because they were required to, but because they found value in having a safe space to talk about their problems with people who understood what they were going through. The basketball tournament that had filled Terry with such anxiety had turned out to be a triumph, not because his team had won, though they had performed admirably, but because of the way he had conducted himself throughout the competition. Parents and community members who had come expecting to see the old Terry, the one who needed to dominate and intimidate, instead witnessed a man who taught his players that effort mattered more than outcome, that supporting your teammates was more important than individual glory, and that treating opponents with respect was what separated good athletes from good people. The tournament had become an annual event, and Terry had been asked to serve as the overall coordinator, a responsibility he accepted, with the understanding that sports could be a powerful tool for teaching life lessons if approached with the right mindset and values. Betty's Diner remained the heart of the community, and Ruby continued to serve as its unofficial social coordinator. But the atmosphere of the place had subtly changed in the months following the confrontation. There was a deeper appreciation among the regular patrons for the peace and fellowship they found there, and a greater awareness of how precious these simple moments of human connection really were. Terry had become a regular customer again, but his presence no longer disrupted the harmony of the place. Instead, he had found his own rhythm within the community, stopping by for coffee before work, chatting briefly with other customers about safe topics like the weather or local events, and always treating Ruby and the other staff with the kind of respect that came from someone who understood that everyone deserved dignity, regardless of their position in life. Ed and Martha Reynolds had indeed become unlikely mentors to Terry, meeting with him once a week for coffee and conversation that ranged from practical matters like managing finances and maintaining employment to deeper questions about finding meaning and purpose after experiencing profound failure. Ed's military background had given him insights into the psychology of men who had lost their sense of mission, and he was able to help Terry understand that the discipline and dedication he had once applied to fighting could be redirected toward more constructive goals. Martha's gentle wisdom and unconditional acceptance provided a model of grace that Terry tried to emulate in his own interactions with others, particularly the young people at the center who were looking for examples of how to handle adversity with dignity and hope. Stephen Seagal had left Aspen Heights the day after the confrontation, continuing on whatever journey had brought him to their small town in the first place, but his impact on the community extended far beyond his brief intervention in what could have been a tragic situation. Ruby had framed a newspaper clipping about his martial arts career and hung it behind the counter, not as a shrine to celebrity, but as a reminder that heroes often appeared in unexpected forms, and that true strength was best measured not by what someone could destroy, but by what they chose to protect and preserve. The story of his calm professional handling of Terry's aggression had become part of local folklore, but more importantly, it had become a teaching tool for parents and educators who wanted to show young people that there were alternatives to violence, even in situations that seemed to demand aggressive responses. The youth center had established a scholarship fund in Seagal's honor, providing financial assistance to local kids who wanted to pursue martial arts training, with instructors who emphasized discipline, self-control, and respect for others rather than aggression and dominance. Terry had been instrumental in organizing fundraising events for the scholarship, and had used his connections in the fighting world to bring in guest speakers who could talk to the kids about the real purpose of martial arts training and the importance of using physical skills responsibly. The program had been so successful that it had been featured in a regional newspaper, bringing positive attention to Aspen Heights and inspiring similar programs in neighboring communities. The transformation of Terry Kline had ripple effects throughout the community, inspiring other people to examine their own approaches to conflict and their own assumptions about strength and weakness. The truck drivers who had witnessed the confrontation had spread the story throughout their network of contacts at truck stops and diners across the region, carrying the message that there were better ways to handle disputes than the traditional reliance on threats and intimidation. Old Pete had written a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, reflecting on what he had learned about the nature of true courage and the importance of giving people second chances when they demonstrated genuine commitment to change. Even the young couple, Sarah and David, who had been dating casually at the time of the incident, had found that their shared experience of witnessing something profound had deepened their relationship and led them to approach their own disagreements with more patience and understanding. As another Sunday afternoon settled over Aspen Heights, the same golden light that had illuminated that fateful confrontation months earlier streamed through the windows of Betty's diner, casting familiar patterns on the worn linoleum floor. Ed and Martha Reynolds sat in their usual booth sharing peach cobbler and coffee, just as they had for years, but with an even deeper appreciation for the simple blessings of peace, companionship, and community. Ruby moved between tables with her characteristic efficiency, but also with a heightened awareness of the stories being written in small moments between ordinary people who were doing their best to live with kindness and integrity. Toby, who was now a senior in high school and planning to study education in college, credited his experience of witnessing the confrontation and its aftermath with helping him understand the kind of teacher he wanted to become, someone who could help troubled kids find better paths forward, just as Terry had been helped to find his. The story of what happened at Betty's diner that Sunday afternoon had become more than just a local legend. It had become a parable about the possibility of redemption, the power of choosing peace over violence, and the way that individual acts of courage and compassion could create ripple effects that transformed entire communities. Terry Kline was no longer Terry the Titan, and he was grateful for that transformation. Every day he woke up in his small apartment, the one he had been able to afford after saving money from his construction job. He no longer carried the burden of living up to an image that had never really suited him. Instead, he had found something better, the satisfaction of knowing that his life had meaning beyond his own needs and desires, that he was contributing to something larger than himself, and that he had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength came not from the ability to defeat others, but from the willingness to help them succeed. The diner continued to serve its simple meals to grateful customers. The youth center continued to provide hope and guidance to kids who needed both, and the town of Aspen Heights continued to prove that sometimes the most important stories were the ones that unfolded quietly in small places between ordinary people who chose to see the best in each other, even when that choice required considerable faith and courage. The confrontation that had threatened to bring violence and chaos to their peaceful community had instead become the catalyst for renewal and growth, reminding everyone involved that every ending could also be a beginning, and that it was never too late to choose a better path forward, as long as there were people willing to show the way with patience, wisdom, and the kind of love that saw potential for good even in the most unlikely places. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.